This video is intended for the beginners. Oops, got my fly unzipped. Hey guys, Jack here. Today I'm going to be making a video on Bowdrill fire making. This is going to be the most basic video and the first video in a series of making fire with the Bowdrill. This video is geared towards those of you who have maybe never done this before or live in an urban environment where, you know, your wood access is basically the lumber store. So I'm going to be using materials that you can get from almost any lumber store or Home Depot, and I'm going to be talking about the most basic concepts. So today, like I said, I'm going to be using stuff that comes from a hardware store. So keep that in mind when you're watching this video. If you're more advanced and you've done Bowdrill before, then hang tight, and pretty soon here I'll be doing a video on utilizing wild materials and then eventually using nothing but what is found around you. No paracord, no knife, etc. So this is the first in a series and the most basic, and is geared towards the people who have maybe never done this before or tried it a little bit with no success. The reason that I like to use incense cedar and that I like to use materials from the hardware store is, one, they're accessible to the average person, right? So this is a huge issue. Not everybody knows what the best trees are, first off. Even if you tell them, they might not be able to identify those trees, and it might take too much effort for them to actually go to their local park and, you know, harvest some wood. And oftentimes it's illegal to do that. So getting your materials from a hardware store legally and ultimately fairly effortlessly is going to encourage more people to learn the Bowdrill, and it's going to encourage you to actually go and practice and build kits. So today I'm going to be using incense cedar, paracord, and jute twine to make a fire, and I'm going to be discussing the technique in detail. And I'm going to try and keep this video short and sweet, and hopefully this can be a reference to many of my students who've come to the class that I teach, or I teach several classes, but they come to the basic class and oftentimes, you know, they forget some of the stuff because we teach so much stuff in this one-day course. So this will be a great reference for them, and those of you on YouTube who are just looking for something simple, no frills, how to do the Bowdrill. And yeah, so I hope you enjoy, and let's get started. Okay, so I've got the parts and pieces that we're going to use to carve our Bowdrill kit. And I've also got an example of a Bowdrill kit that's already been carved. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll pull them out of my bark container here. Dump all of our goodies out. So the pieces that we're going to be using today, there's 4 pieces. So we've got a fireboard, a spindle, a bow, which is a curved stick with a piece of paracord attached to it, a handhold. This is a rock found off the beach, but you can use any split piece of hardwood or even a piece of cedar if you use some pine sap or soap to lubricate that hole so that it doesn't burn. The biggest problem with handholds is, you know, that are made out of wood is they tend to have a lot of friction, whereas a rock or a piece of bone or something hard, even metal, is going to be virtually friction free. Although we do carve our spindle in such a way that we try and reduce the friction as much as possible. So again, a bow, a handhold, a spindle, and a fireboard. Other than that, all we need is a knife, good carving knife, and some jute twine. And jute twine is often known as gardening twine, and you can get it at almost any hardware store. It comes in a big roll, and I suggest you cut your pieces of jute twine into, like, I don't know, 3-inch strands, and we'll get into how to process that out later. Now, if you don't want to use jute twine, there's tons of natural materials that you can use for tinder, and maybe at some point I'll do a video on that, but for now I want to keep this short and sweet, and we're going to be using jute twine. It's extremely flammable. It works great for using a ferrocerium rod, flint and steel with char cloth, you know, basically anything as far as an ignition source, a lighter, you name it. So anyways, and as far as the kit, that is already carved. I'll do a close-up of it, but I've got a piece of maple here and a piece of sotol, which is extremely soft and is the sotol that is, and it's a really great friction fire making wood, and it's almost too soft sometimes for certain people that are used to harder woods, but it's almost like using matches once you get the technique down. And you might be thinking, well, why don't I use that? Well, maybe if you decide to drive to the desert and cut some sotol, then you can go ahead and use that, but you're not going to get that at Home Depot. So here are our pieces, a little bit more of a close-up for you. On the right, we have a bow that was made from a piece of redwood. Moving towards the left, we've got a incense cedar Bowdrill kit, the spindle, the fireboard, as well as our rock handhold. And we'll be using that handhold and the bow on the right, the redwood one, for this video. As we move further to the left, you'll see we have our spindle blank and our fireboard blank. Again, those are made from incense cedar. We've got our Mora companion knife. And just above that, we have our sotol and maple Bowdrill kit. And above that, we have my Osage orange flex bow, which was made from a piece of wood that was split out of a bow stave in the bow making process. Now, you can see that this is a square piece of wood, pretty obvious. The length of your spindle, it should be as long as you can get it, although probably no longer than, I don't know. I like to do it like from pinky to thumb if you're throwing a shaka, right? Surfs up. But if, you know, this is about that long. In a survival situation, I like to go long and thin. But when you're just learning, usually pinky to thumb distance works good. Now, if you have a problem kneeling over, sometimes it's good to use a spindle that's like anywhere from 8 inches to a foot long. I wouldn't go much longer than a foot because you'll tend to run into issues there. So first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna turn this into a nice round cylinder. So we're gonna start by just removing the edges. And we want to make it as even as possible. So like almost like a dowel, like a, I don't know, 3/4 inch thick dowel or something like that. So it should be pretty darn straight. Now it doesn't have to be perfectly circular. It's more important that it's straight. Sometimes making it too smooth can cause problems and can cause the string to prematurely slip. The more edges you have, at least throughout the center of the spindle, the better the string is going to grab. So funny enough, a lot of people will see these old survival guides and see a square Bowdrill spindle. And yeah, using a full square isn't going to work very well, but if the center of your spindle was more rectangular in shape, it actually would work quite well, and is one technique I use for troubleshooting when students are having a hard time and their spindle gets really polished and the string begins to slip on the spindle. Now the next thing we're going to be doing is carving points on our spindle. So the first point that I'm going to carve is the one that's going to go in the handhold. And this is going to be different in the length and the taper than the point that's going to go into the fireboard. Now the reason for that is we want our handhold point to be longer and more tapered to reduce the surface area that's in contact with the handhold itself. I mentioned earlier that friction can be a problem in the handhold. If you're using a handhold that's creating smoke or lots of friction, it's slowing you down. So we want all of our pressure and friction concentrated on the base of the spindle. So you can see here I've carved a nice little point, and it's about 1.5 inches long. as long as it has a nice taper to it. You know, just imagine, okay, if I were to burn this down or carve it down a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch, I don't want it to be the full circumference of the spindle, right? Now, if you were to carve it down a 1/2 inch and it's the full circumference of the spindle, make it longer. Now, the end that's gonna go into the fireboard is also going to be a point, but it's gonna be much shorter and the angle is gonna be much steeper. The reason for that is we want to concentrate the friction and we want the full surface area of the spindle to be making contact with the fireboard, because that's where the fire is gonna be created. And you want your points to be centered in the spindle if you can. So here's our spindle. Hopefully you guys can see that. The next thing we need to do is put a guide hole in our fireboard. Now, the ideal thickness for your fireboard is just shy of 1 inch. You don't want to go much thinner than 1/2 inch, because the reason for that is your spindle is going to be removing material from the fireboard, right? And it's going to burn downward. So the thicker your fireboard is, the more time you have to make a coal, and oftentimes the more attempts you have. Now, on the flip side of that, if your fireboard is too thick, it's going to create too much distance for the dust that is created from the friction to fall, and ultimately it's going to take a lot more work to fill up that notch so that you actually ignite that dust. So there's sort of like a happy medium, and that's anywhere from like just shy of 1 inch to just above 1/2 inch. Something like this will work. And you know, feel free to experiment. Ideally, your fireboard is nice and flat. This one has a little bit of curve to it, but that's all right. We'll make it work. So making the guide hole is pretty simple. All you need to do, and you know, my knife safety is not very good here, but this is how I have to demonstrate it, is you need to choose a spot somewhere in the center. Don't go too close to the edges. So somewhere, I'm just gonna go right here in the center. And obviously you don't want to do this into your hand, but I got to keep this video short for YouTube. So we've got our little guide hole here, right? And the goal with this guide hole is that it's deep enough that we can put our spindle in there and it's not going to pop out. Okay? Now, if we didn't have a deep guide hole or one at all, the spindle's just going to go all over the place and it's not going to keep the friction concentrated in one spot. So we want to create a nice guide hole so that our spindle is going to stay where we want it to. Now, when you are positioning your guide hole or putting your guide hole in the fireboard, you want to make sure that you leave some space between the edge of the spindle and the edge of the fireboard. There should be anywhere from like 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch between the hole that you will burn in, so you kind of have to eyeball it and look down the spindle towards the fireboard, but you want a gap to be here. So you can see kind of where my finger is going. I don't know if you guys can see this, but right about here, you need some gap to be there. Otherwise, if it's too close, your spindle will then hang over the fireboard, and that's not gonna work out too well. So let's go ahead and get our kit burned in and talk a little bit about building our bow and bow tension, or bowstring tension. Okay, so your bow is ideally something fairly rigid. Maybe it can have a little bit of flex in it, but you don't want it to be something that's like so thin that it's just gonna snap or bend a whole lot. So you want something semi-rigid, and the ideal length is from your armpit to your hand, or about that, right? This one's a little long, but if it works for you, then, you know, this has a handle, so the actual part that you're bowing on is about from my armpit to the base of my palm. So the key with the bow is, one, to make sure you have nice notches on the end. So you can see there's a good notch in there, so that paracord isn't going anywhere. String tension is very important, so it's really important to get nice deep notches that go at least 1/3 of the way through your bow. On both ends, right? Now, if this bow was, you know, if this handle was not here, you know, you'd want your notches to be almost on the very end, you know, about 1/2 inch to 1 inch from the end of the bow. As far as the diameter of the bow goes, anywhere from, you know, 1.5 inches to 3/4 of an inch will work. The key is it is being semi-rigid. Now, if you're using natural fibers, you would want a bow that flexes more, but when you're using paracord, the cord can take a whole lot of stress. So we don't need the bow to compensate for that stress. As far as string tension goes, this is one of the things that students run into as far as problems the most. The string doesn't need to be taut like a bow and arrow, but it will have to be adjusted, right? So the only way to know if your string tension's good is to test it with your spindle. And I'll show you guys how to do that in a second. Now, as far as the handhold goes, you really want something that's gonna fit comfortably in your hand. That's the goal here. So this rock is a little small, but you want something that you can hold comfortably and not something that you're gonna be like just barely holding on to, because the key with the handhold is to keep it straight up and down. No twisting from side to side. When you twist from side to side, it creates excess friction, as well as it provides the spindle an opportunity, right? Just imagine my finger is a spindle here and I twist it to go flying, right? So we wanna keep our spindle straight up and down, and we want to keep our handhold nice and steady and firmly locked into our shin. And you guys will see that here soon. But it shouldn't be the kind of thing where you're like having a hard time figuring out whether the hole is facing down or not. And as far as the hole goes, I like something a little bit larger because it provides an opportunity for my spindle to, you know, a little bit of room for my spindle to wobble around and do whatever it needs to do. Also, if I do kind of mess up and put my handhold at an angle a little bit, the bigger that hole is, the more forgiving the handhold will be to improper technique. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind though is if the hole is really small or really shallow, it's going to be really easy for the spindle to pop out, and if the hole is really deep, it's going to create potentially excess friction, especially if you do twist it at all. So you want a kind of a happy medium, and you know, that's just something you're gonna have to experiment with. If your spindle's popping out a whole lot from your handhold, you're either twisting it too much or your hole is too small. Bow string tension is really important because if the string is too loose, what's going to happen is the bow will slide, or the string will slide on the spindle. And as soon as the string starts to slide on the spindle, it'll begin to burnish or polish the spindle. What that's going to do is it's going to make it so the string has to be so tight that it continues to compress the wood grain. And ultimately, if you do polish the spindle or you don't have the proper string tension, say it's too loose and then too tight, you're just going to run into a lot of problems and it's going to be kind of a nightmare. So what you're looking for, and I just use square knots to tie the string on. And by the way, I like to hold the thicker end of the bow. I find if you hold the thin end of the bow, you have all this extra weight floating around over here, and that can create, you know, problems, and the string has a tendency to want to ride up and down the spindle. So anyways, I typically only adjust the end that my hand goes to, right? So I don't want to be adjusting, well, the reason I do that is I leave a tag end, okay? And now if the tag end's at the front of your bow, you know, as your spindle is spinning, that tag end can get caught in here and it can basically stop your spindle from spinning. So I like to hold onto the tag end with my hand, and I like to adjust the bow where I'm holding it. Okay, so now to string the spindle, and this is going to take quite a bit of practice, and I recommend you just keep doing it until you figure it out. You lay the spindle in between the string and the bow, gently twist while pushing upwards on the spindle so that you can grab both ends of the spindle. Then go ahead and pull it in place. And if you were to let go of it, if the tension is right, it should want to go flying out. Another indication that your string tension is good is if you can't get the spindle to slide without you actually spinning it, right? So if you can force it to go like to slide, which I can't right now, then without it spinning, then it's too loose and you need to untie the bow, pull it a little bit tighter. Usually you're adjusting it in small increments, and try it again. And it's just trial and error until you get it. And then once you get a feel for it, usually you don't have to, you know, it only takes 1 or 2 times to get it at the right tension. But it will get loose if you're using new paracord. The string will stretch. And it'll also need constant adjustment as time goes on. So it's not going to stay at the same tension once you get it there. So a little bit of a better close-up here with the string. I like to brace the bottom end of the bow up against my belly, twist, grab both ends, pull it in tight. Again, if you were to let go, it should want to go flying off. So if you are right-handed, you'll put your left foot over the fireboard, your right hand will hold the bow, your left hand will hold the handhold, and the key part of this is to lock your wrist into your shin. Okay, so I put my armpit kind of up against my thigh here, and I position my foot so that the arch of my foot is over the fireboard. And I want my foot nice and close to that hole. I don't want my toe way off to the side. Okay, so I want my foot to have enough pressure on the fireboard so it's not going to slide around, but it should be really close to that hole. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I have everything locked in. You notice my wrist is locked into my shin. It's not going to be wobbling. If I weren't to do that, then it's going to wobble all over and my spindle's just going to go flying. So I hold the very end of the bow and I start with nice smooth strokes. Now you want to be bowing straight back and forth, okay? Imagine that there's a ceiling and a floor, and if your bow goes up or down, it's going to hit that. And when you burn in your kit, you don't need to go super fast. You just kind of want to hit a nice pace and stay there. Kind of like you're running a marathon. So what you're looking for is a good amount of smoke, or smoke period, and a nice dark kind of like coffee bean color on the end of your spindle and on your fireboard. Now once you can do this fairly comfortably and you feel like you could sustain that for up to a minute or 2 minutes, then you're ready to carve your notch and make your ember. Once you've got your kit burned in and you have your nice coffee color and you're feeling pretty good about you know, and comfortable, like your wrist and your shin are locked in together, you know, your bow is going straight back and forth, you're not going kind of like up and down, your bowstring's not riding up or down the spindle. If it is, that means you're not bowing straight back and forth. So the next thing we need to do is we need to carve our notch and make our tinder bundle. So when carving the notch, I want you guys to imagine that this is a pizza or a pie, and we're going to be taking a slice out of it, okay? So when carving the notch, you want to just make sure 2 things. 1, the notch is not wider than the hole itself. And 2, it doesn't go past the center of the hole or the deepest part of the hole. Now once you've carved your notch, you're still not ready to make fire yet. You need to make your tinder bundle, right? So you take that jute twine that you've cut into 3-inch sections, you know, take, I don't know, 10 or 15 pieces of that twine, and what you'll do is you'll untwist each strand, and it'll usually come apart into 3 to 5 separate strands depending on the twine manufacturer, and you make a big pile of these single strands, okay? Now, once you've untwisted them all, then you'll take each strand one by one and fluff it up until you have a big fluffy pile of blonde looking fuzz or tinder. I want you guys to think of right here as your slice of pie. And I don't want it to go past the center where that little white mark is in the middle of that hole, okay? So the first thing we'll do is we're gonna cut a wedge out of the top. The reason I like to start with that is I can see it, okay? And we're not going all the way to the center yet. Now I do the same thing on the bottom. And the notch is kind of the key to this whole thing, so it's important that you do it right. Now this will leave you with an hourglass shape, so then you just go ahead and cut out the center of that. And you can continue that process of going to the top, going to the bottom, and then hitting the center until your notch goes to the center, or just shy of the center, I mean. Now I like to box my notches off. Some people like to have them come to a point. Neither is better than the other. It's just personal preference. So there's our notch. You can see it goes straight through the fireboard and stops just shy of the center. So now what we're gonna do is we'll go ahead and make our tinder bundle, and we'll go ahead and make fire. So here's our tinder, and what we're gonna go ahead and do is we're just gonna keep untwisting it. I've already started, into single strands. And you might be thinking, well, why do that? Why not just shred it right away? Well, you could try, but it's pretty hard. So once we've got all of our single strands, we'll go ahead, and I've got a lot here, so I'm gonna take some out. Fluff them up one by one. So now you just want to make it into a nice little bird's nest. Just like that. Now you don't want it to be too fluffed out. You want to make sure you kind of compress it a little. Otherwise the ember will just burn itself out because it'll burn the material around it. So it's going to burn the material around it, but you want that material to be in contact with the other material so that it doesn't all just burn out rather than lighting on fire. Now the last thing you need is a leaf, or you could take your knife and cut a shaving off to catch your coal. Get nice and comfortable. Lock your wrist into your shin, get the arch of your foot over the fireboard. Get your handhold all comfy. It's gonna be a little awkward at first. Then once you get it moving, now what you're looking for is the dust to continue smoking once it's done. So I'll gently tap it to release the ember, and I want to see that that ember is going to continue to smoke. Never blow on it, don't rush, don't pick it up and throw it straight in the bundle. If the coal is really small, you can go ahead and take some of your extra dust here and put it on there. You know, if you're doing multiple attempts and you've got a pile of dust, keep putting it in the notch, right? If you don't get it the first time, go ahead and put this puppy right back in here and keep bowing. So now what you'll go ahead and do is get your nest and your bird's nest or tinder bundle, whatever you want to call it. Dump your coal in there. Gently wrap it up. I like to wrap up 4 corners without smashing it, and then start blowing on it. You want to keep turning it, look where the smoke's coming out. Keep it above your face so the smoke doesn't go into your eyes, and don't blow too close to it because the moisture from your breath can slow this process down. And you've made fire. At that point, you'd want to already have had your bird or your teepee fire made, and you blow that thing into flame, stick it in there, and then enjoy your fire. It's one of the most magical things I think that humans can do, because we are the fire people. We're the only animal that can create and control fire, and the Bowdrill is our invention. A little bit of history on it. It was found in what is now known as Pakistan, and I believe was originally used to drill holes through lapis lazuli, and they used jasper drill bits, and then at some point maybe they figured out that they could make fire with it. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe one came before the other, but there's not a whole lot of information out there on it. Anyways, get out there, go get some cedar, make yourself a kit, a little bit of paracord, a nice carving knife. If you don't have a carving knife, I recommend buying a Mora. It's cheapest budget knife and outperforms 90% of the blades out there that are the same size. You know, I've spent quite a bit of money on knives, and I'm still blown away by the Mora every time I use it. Comes super sharp, and you can get one of these for probably less than 30 bucks, maybe 15. This is the companion, but they make a bunch of cool ones, so check it out. The company's called Mora Knife, M-O-R-A-K-N-I-V. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe, and like I said before, I'm going to be doing a series on Bowdrill. This is number 1. Next up, we're going to be going out on the land and harvesting some materials off the land, and all we're going to bring with us is a knife and a piece of paracord. And then after that, we'll go ahead and go out there with nothing but our hands and our brain, and we'll get it done. So thanks again. Please subscribe and go make some fires. Common problems that people run into when they're learning the Bowdrill. So this is a little follow-up to the video that I posted on Bowdrill for beginners. And the most common problems that I see are 1, improper notches. So make sure that you're carving your notch to the parameters that I described in my video. 2, improper bowstring tension. So you should be able to push down really hard on your spindle without the string slipping. So if your kit is squeaking, or you're not getting a whole lot of dust or smoke, and the color left in your fireboard is a very light brown, not quite coffee color, then that's telling me that you're not pushing down hard enough, and you're probably not doing so because your string is too loose. So again, when you string that thing, you shouldn't be able to slide it back and forth. It's really helpful when you're stringing your bow to brace the bow up against your belly, okay? And if the string is riding up or down the spindle, what that means is you're bowing like this, you're rocking your bow. If your spindle is constantly popping out of the fireboard and or handhold, that means you're either twisting your handhold, or the hole in your fireboard is not deep enough, or check the bottom of your spindle and make sure that it's a nice round shape. Sometimes these things will get really flat, and you basically won't be able, it'll just kind of slide off the hole. At that point, you can recarve it a little bit and redress your hole, make it a little deeper, and then go ahead and keep going. One other thing, if your spindle drifts into your notch, that's telling me and you that you've carved your notch too deep, and or you're angling your spindle in the direction of the notch. The spindle should be straight up and down. There should be no angle to it. And the thicker your spindle is, the less rotations you're going to get per bow length. So my advice is no chubby spindles, and don't, once they get pretty short, say like 4 inches, you might as well just throw that thing in the fire or put it in your kit as a memento and carve a new one. The longer the better. Again, you don't want to go over like 12 or 13 inches in the beginning, but there's other techniques that utilize, a spindle that's 3 or 4 feet in length, and eventually we'll do that. So thanks again. Please subscribe. I hope you all get your Bowdrill fires, and I wish you all the best. And if you'd like to come take a class with me, go ahead and shoot me a message, and I can show you where to sign up. And yeah, have a great day. go make some coals.